Well, I want to welcome everyone who's decided to join us today. I'm Greg Newman. I'm Corporate Communications Manager for World Council of Credit Unions. We are hosting a webinar this morning called Today's Racial Turmoil and the Credit Union Answer. And I'm going to turn things over first to Brian Branch, our President and CEO, to talk a little bit about why he wanted to have Renée Sattiewhite, President and CEO from the African American Credit Union Coalition, on to talk about this important topic today. Brian?
Thanks, Greg. At the World Council, the work that we do is about financial inclusion, but that's not work that we do in a vacuum. The purpose of our work is always about improving people's lives. That's the bottom line for us. And it's always striking around the world that it's at times of crisis and conflict that we find credit unions are on the front line. And when it's time for healing, we find credit unions are very much in the heart of that kind of healing for their communities. Our values are about non-discrimination, about equality, and about equity. And so we can't be unaffected when we see racial injustice and violence happening anywhere in the world. Martin Luther King said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So Renée, thank you. You're doing us a great service today by sharing with us. We've asked Renée to help us to understand the problem and to talk with us about what can credit unions do to address not just the current crisis, but the wider societal problem. Nelson Mandela said, "Action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming. But vision with action can change the world." So this is our opportunity to understand, to learn, and to be part of the solution. And for that, we thank you, Renée. Thanks, Greg.
Wow. So thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Brian, thank you so much for the invitation. AACUC is obviously at the forefront of some of this, especially for the United States. It's so important that everyone understand that this is an opportunity for credit unions to unite and for me to show the nation that we can lead in eliminating racism. Because right now, some of what's going on is about systemic racism, and those are the things that we have to overcome. And I believe we can do that. At AACUC, we're an inclusive organization, and we really want to make sure that people understand that this is a time for healing. And what are the next steps? What can we do? There's a lot of confusion. A lot of people are wondering, how can I weather through this? What does that look like? Why are people reacting the way that they are? I asked Brian to have questions sent to me, and boy, did he send me questions, lots of questions. And so there's about 48 questions here. And so I thought that I would just take an opportunity to read some of them in answer to what can we do and how we can move forward. But before I do that, I want to just tell you a little bit about what we're doing at AACUC. So one of the things that we decided to do for our membership is to have some conversations about healing. Let's look at what the trauma is. How are you feeling about it? How does that work for you? And so the conversations have been very, very good. Our membership has been very appreciative and very supportive, because it's oftentimes you just need to be heard. And sometimes I don't think that we listen well enough. For those of you who know me, I'm the possibility of people serving other people passionately. And I need to do a shameless plug for my ladies in the Global Women's Network. I have on my sash today, so thank you for that. But as being a person who really loves credit unions and wants people to serve passionately to one another, I think that here's an opportunity again, where the cooperative principles that we've been founded on as the credit union movement, we are in a unique place to lead this nation in showing them how we can do this. We've got the new 8th cooperative principle that the United States credit unions have embraced. And with embracing that, it gives us an opportunity to look beyond just what the cooperative principles were when we first started in the credit union movement. We have an opportunity to include diversity and inclusion. What does that look like now? Our countries are so different and so vast. And so it's important to look at how you can be a catalyst for change. So what does that look like? Well, at AACUC, it looks like joining together, kind of embracing one another, the differences. It's not, I believe, since we all bleed red, right? We all bleed red. When we cut ourselves, we're going to bleed red. So sometimes it's not about what the color of your skin, but what's in your heart. What's your sincere thought about what you want to do? And so I just want to turn to a couple of the questions, because some of them really were very, very challenging. And I think that that's what we're going through now, a challenging time. Someone said, when a colleague of color says something, how do we understand them rather than be angry? Let me repeat that question. When a colleague of color says something, how do we understand them rather than be angry? The first question I would tell you on that question, the answer I would have is, imagine that that's happening to you or one of your family members. So whatever that situation is, and a colleague comes to you and they're upset, certainly you want to show empathy. You want them to know that you care. You want them to know that in this time of turmoil, you're not being willfully ignorant. You just don't know how to address them. You don't know what to say. And I believe that some of our leaders, they're looking for how can we help? But most often don't know what to say and how to have that conversation. It's important to remember that we are founded on the credit union principles. And so when we're looking at the motto and the philosophy, our philosophy of credit unions is people helping people. Well, when you start there and you know that that's what you want to forge to, I believe that you can make a difference just in being kind to one another. Another question that I thought was really interesting, and it says, how do we understand the difference between protesters and rioters or looters? And Trevor Noah, who was from Africa, he did something very interesting on one of his shows, and he talked about society contract. And so I'd like to just review something that he said, because I thought that was very powerful. And whenever I'm asked, how do you look at this? How do you break this down? I thought his explanation was really, really very good. And so some of what he said was, and when you're looking at people who are rioting and looting, you need to look at what happened. So this is a symptom. What's the problem? And all the images, the relentless images that we've been seeing through the media about how we can continue, how some of the injustices have been performed. And I don't want to go over the graphic details, but some of those images that we see over and over again, it's how do we as a society, we've said we're going to live in harmony and we're going to live in a safe space. And so when the African American community continues to see images of violence against them, it's difficult to want to be in the same space. And so when people are rioting and looting, it doesn't mean that they don't care about their communities. I believe it's a symptom of, so what are we supposed to do? You continue to tell us that we don't matter. So that's the visual, that we don't matter as an African American community if we still continue to see images and hear about people being killed by police officers and or citizens and don't have proper retribution for that or justice. And so when you're looking at that, it's important to see how does that break down. So what Trevor Noah was saying was, how about looking at the fact that things have been done, injustice have been done over and over and over again to this one community, not just our community, obviously, but this community. And so the reaction is, it's a powder keg. I think a lot of what happened recently in the protests that are happening, the uprising, I believe that it's because people are frustrated. And when you see so many graphics over and over again, it makes you want to get in action. So I applaud the people who are doing peaceful protests. I think that's great, and that's how things change. If we're complacent and not doing any of the changing, then we're not helping this. We're not helping the situation at all, and being a catalyst for the solutions. So again, credit unions can do so much to make sure that people are heard and that there's healing that starts. I wanted to find out from Brian. So Brian, I'm going to put you on the spot here. What's the toughest question that you think needs to be asked to people who are not Black or not African American. And so I know I'm putting you on the spot, Brian, but hopefully that you are able to answer.
Well, thanks, Renee. Very often we hear about
Hey, Brian,
white
if you could
privilege.
turn your webcam on, sorry.
Very often we hear about white privilege, and so this is a question about empathy. And very often the response I see is defensive. Frankly, my initial response when I was told about my white privilege was fairly defensive. But for me, really, and people ask, well, I work hard. I haven't done anything bad to anybody. So why do you accuse me of white privilege? Well, the issue, I think, is that not about how hard we have worked, what kinds of obstacles we have faced in our lives, but frankly, if we're not a person of color, if I'm not an African American, there are obstacles I have not had to face. In other words, it hasn't been harder just because of the color of my skin. And just understanding that, I think, is important to begin the kind of conversations and dialogue that we need for this healing.
Well, and thank you for that, Brian. I absolutely agree that sometimes it's a difficult question to hear, it's a difficult question to ask, and it's a difficult question to answer. But it's not to say that people of color don't feel like that white privilege, people who are not African American or minority have not suffered. That's certainly not it. There certainly has been suffering, especially when people are poor, there is that suffering. And so the many different tragedies have befallen lots of people. But when you're looking at that statement, it's important to know that there's so many opportunities that other people have. When I walk into a room, if I'm not dressed a certain way, if I don't carry myself in a certain way, then there are people who make automatic assumptions about who I am, what I'm capable of doing. And oftentimes we don't know people's ability, but we make assumptions on what people look like or what they sound like and what they're dressed like. And so when you're looking at that question or that answer, it's all about, can you do something different? What is it that you can do different? It's not white privilege is something that I can't have because I'm not white. I have a last name that's white. And when I'm doing a telephone interview, I sometimes use a different voice so I can get that job. So having to go through jump through different hoops and still not be able to live an equal life, that's what happens, and that's some of what happens, making it an uncomfortable situation for so many. Yeah.
Renee, I was just going to hop in here quick and let people know who are watching that they have questions. If you have questions for Renee, there's a little tab on your screen that'll say questions on it. It's a drop-down menu, and if you click on that, you can type in questions there, and as they come in, we'll ask them of Renee and have her answer. So if you are interested in asking a question, you can do that right there.
Outstanding, outstanding. So I did some work with PSCU and happy about it. Really great work last week. And we talked about in Sankofa in their ERG, and I really want to commend the leadership of PSCU. Chuck Fagan did just a wonderful job making sure that the African American ERGs were heard. And they did it over a span of 2 days. And what came out of that for me is people are really, really anxious to know how they stand in their organizations. And do their organizations support their communities? And we've been getting a lot of requests from AACUC for AACUC to come and have some conversations, but also what can we do as an organization? What can others do as organizations? What can CEOs do to show that they are truly committed to eliminating racism and looking at DEI, making sure that that's part of what their core values are in their credit unions? I want to give a shout out to Mike Lord over at CQ of North Carolina. he put out this wonderful statement, and he also, and it didn't hurt that he called me and asked me where he could send a check. So just his commitment to AACUC was doing $125,000. That's an enormous pledge, and really we're grateful for it. But leadership like that is exemplary. And so what can credit unions do? When you have a credit union CEO who's looking at it from the standpoint that the service from the credit union is for all people, and the equity needs to be there. When the credit unions try to make sure that that equity is coming up, that's a wonderful thing. And so I'm just really pleased to see that a lot of our credit unions are leading the effort in making sure that the communities know and that their employees know that they have a way to help the community, if you will. I have also received many, many calls from different people letting me know that they were not happy with the statements or the non-active statements that their CEOs or the organizations weren't making. And so I implore you that if you're in leadership, you want to make sure that your staff knows, especially if you have people of color. Well, it really doesn't matter now. It's just it's all a hodgepodge, and we should be addressing everyone actually. And so the people who are the leaders who are looking at how they can answer the questions and be empathetic, that's a wonderful thing. Sometimes in some of the credit unions, there's been nothing. There's been silence. And that silence can be translated to your team members as you don't care. So you don't want that. You want to be authentic, but have something that you want to say that's real and impactful.
Yeah, we actually just had someone put in a question of they want to know your opinion of why you think so few credit unions, this is their question, why do you think few credit unions have put forth strong anti-racism statements in the wake of George Floyd's death, and how can we get credit unions to align with social justice instead of remaining silent?
I think the biggest issue is that people don't know what to say. They don't know, they don't want to offend, they don't want to misstep, they don't want to misrepresent. Our credit unions, organizations are run by our members. And so you have to be careful with how you represent your membership. So depending on your set group and what that looks like, it may be a conversation you need to have with your board of directors and your senior management team on how you respond. If you don't have anyone of color on your management team, you probably want to get an outside consultant to come in and have a conversation with you. But in order to heal, we must address the problem. And if you're a credit union leader or a CEO and you don't want to address the problem, then you're not going to move forward with your organization, nor will you be impactful in your community. So we urge people to not just make a statement to be making a statement, but to make a statement that's going to make change, that you've got a commitment to change and you want to make that change. And so I think that the reasons why people are not stepping up is because they don't know what to say. It's not because they don't want to. Again, the credit union movement, people helping people, is our philosophy. So with that philosophy, we can't help but affect change.
Yeah, those are great points. And actually, a really interesting short question just came in, and one that I don't think we think about very much, but someone asked if you could explain the difference in your mind between racism and white privilege.
That's an excellent question. Okay. I think white privilege is something that has happened time after time after time. So it's not so much that people know that they have white privilege. White privilege is you can look at a person and their color of their skin helps them get where they're going to get, or gives them a plethora of opportunities that people of color don't have. Racism is people who are deliberately holding another minority back, or another group of people back by doing things that are systemic, under control. So I believe that racism is not a controlled environment, but a controlled way of being that consistently cuts off people from being as equal or have equity.
Great question here, and this is probably something a lot of people in the audience would want to know, both from an executive and a credit union professional level. What can marginalized credit union young professionals do to effectively raise their voices despite credit union stances on some racial injustice issues? Thank you for sharing your leadership with us.
Wow. And you're welcome. I believe that we have a young professional summit. So we have young people who are just super. And I believe that young people, you have the power of social media. You have so much that other people haven't had generations before you. So you have an opportunity to really pave the way to show, well, actually the protesters are doing that, and mostly young people out there doing that. And you can protest or have your opinion in a nonviolent way. In the credit union system, I think that you get together and you do things through social media. I know that our YPS group has a LinkedIn. You get with other like-minded people. Most of the leagues have a young professionals section of information that they provide. I think you get with the leagues and the league's young professionals, and you get with them, people in your state, and then you make a statement. Show solidarity for one another. Show that you guys want to have things differently. You are the leaders. You are the ones who are going to be coming up and leading and being the CEOs of the credit unions.
This is a really interesting question as well. And you know, credit unions vary in sizes, but we all know we're not banks, and some credit unions are smaller than others. How can credit unions overcome the too small for that mentality when it comes to implementing DEI initiatives? And for those who don't know, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives around hiring, around selecting vendors, and so forth.
So we at AACUC, we work with Jill Nowacki out of Humanity, and specifically AACUC, we have a great love for small credit unions, and we want to see them succeed. And so we do whatever we can to assist those credit unions. When you're at a small credit union, I've had the pleasure of working with many different credit unions around the country, and for several years. And one of the credit unions I spent a whole lot of time with was First Choice Credit Union. First Choice Credit Union, I think right now is probably a little less than 25 million in assets. But that credit union thought it was a big credit union. They did things in a big way, and they're still doing them. Very progressive organization. And so when you're small, I think there was only less than 15 people on staff. When you've got a small staff, a small credit union, what you can do is you can lean on the leagues. The leagues are good resources, especially if you're running a small credit union. They do have opportunity, and they have services that they provide that will help you. I know that John Persakis at the Maryland DC Credit Union League does a really great job of making sure that there are products and services for all of its credit unions, but certainly for the smaller credit unions as well. So the smaller credit unions have an advantage because larger credit unions not necessarily can pivot as quickly as smaller credit unions can. We know that in smaller credit unions, most of us have to do many layers of work, many different positions. You might have responsibility for 2 or 3 jobs. But you do it well because that's what we do in small credit unions. And so I think that being very proactive and reading some literature, there are some of the things that are coming out that can also help the small credit union. But make no mistake about it, just because it's a small credit union doesn't mean you can't adhere to some of those principles that will make your credit union better and make you more efficient and effective with your membership. You can certainly go to get resources at AACUC, Humanity, and your league.
There was a question that came in asking how you think the larger credit union movement can partner with AACUC to make some of these things happen on a broader level.
So, and thank you for that question. It leads me right into what the commitment to change. So the board of directors of AACUC, my dream team board of directors, woohoo! And I know you CEOs on the call, don't be jealous. I've got the dream team of board of directors. So with that, AACUC is looking to lead the movement in making sure that the nation knows that we can eradicate racism. Our commitment to change is Credit Unions Unite Against Racism. And so we're going to launch that this week, and we want credit unions all across the nation. And those of you who are international, please join with us in eliminating and eradicating racism. Credit Unions Unite Against Racism, because it could be me that's under somebody's foot or dying because the police have broken in my home without a warrant that let me know that they were coming. And so I think that with AACUC and the commitment from the credit union from credit unions itself, I believe that we can lead this nation in showing them, because of our credit union principles, because of the aid cooperative principle, because of our philosophy of people helping people, that we have the great advantage. We are passionate about serving our members. Credit union people are the best employees of the world because they're trying to help people innately. Credit unions innately want to help people. That's why we were built. That's why credit unions were built. So it's so important that at AACUC, if you want to help get rid of this problem, let's eradicate it forever. Let's look at the strategies that we can take together. One of the things that people say, well, how can I help? I don't know how to help. You can do things like donate to AACUC, obviously, but also in your communities. What communities of color can you go in and you help? What can you do to show that you want to assist? Now at AACUC and the board of directors' commitment is to make sure that we give everyone what they need that we can do to show them how to move forward. So there may be some literature that talks about how to speak to one another. There may be some literature, some ways to do business with people of color that are different than how you're currently doing business. I do believe that we have the bandwidth to ensure that if we're working together and looking at the plan, we can do something well. There's a DEI collective that's a wonderful thing that's been put together for the credit union movement nationally here. And the people who are involved are very, very committed to making the change, to making sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are prime topics for credit unions. We know that in 20 years, the landscape of what people look like are going to be different. The world is going to be much more brown and black in 20 years. The buying power right now in the United States comes from the Hispanic community, and then the African American community is second to that. So it's important that we look at diversity as a business case and not as a welfare case. How can we move forward? So I think that credit unions partner with AACUC and understanding that together we can fight this fight. I had the pleasure of meeting Larry Blanchard a week ago, and knowing that he helped significantly with the HR bill. That's the kind of stuff credit unions do. When Hubert Hoosman was alive, a member of AACUC, one of the board members, he led the effort for the Martin Luther King Monument, where credit unions contributed $1 million to putting up the MLK Monument. So I believe that if we get together as credit union people with our heart, that we can make the difference. I believe that we can come up with a plan that works for everybody.
One thing, I think there's a lot of international credit union professionals on the call today. Can you explain a little bit, I guess, for them? They may not understand this, and I don't think racism is a uniquely American problem, but what we've seen in the last week or two definitely has been concentrated in the United States. And we've had these issues before. And can you share with them what your thoughts are on why we see such a significant issue with this in the United States?
Probably because of how United States was created. So United States was created with settlers coming over and taking over someone else's country. And then when you took over someone else's country, then you brought other people in from their country. And so over the 400 years, African Americans and other people of color have been marginalized in the United States. With that, the progression kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And so now we're at a place where it's things have continued to happen. Has there been progress? Certainly there's been progress. But when you have conditions that try to control people, as I said, racism for me is a construct that is trying to control individuals, control a group of people. And so in that context, that's what's happened over the years, especially for African Americans, that there were different laws that prohibited us from voting, different laws that prohibited us from doing home ownership, marrying people of different races. Those things were punishable by law. And so what has happened is all these rules that continue to happen, these laws that were passed, they have been being dismantled piece by piece, year after year, but there's some that are still in existence, and so in different states. So you have state-run systematic control, and you have federal systematic control. So again, for our international brothers and sisters, it's sometimes with our nation here, we see the same thing over and over again because we haven't as a collective made a decision that we're going to let it go, that is done, it's no longer acceptable, and we're going to do something about it. I believe that time is now. It's not just in the United States that people are protesting. Young people are protesting all over the world, and they say they're standing with us. Racism has to be eradicated, not just for Black Americans, but for everybody who's in a position where they're being marginalized.
We have a pretty good question that was sent in, and it's kind of an example of perhaps what a lot of African American credit union professionals have gone through, or people of color have gone through. The woman writes in that, as a Black woman who has worked for a credit union for over 24 years and finally became a manager 4 years ago after years of trying to get there, but since then it has been an uphill battle to get opportunities to lead projects or be part of initiatives that I'm very qualified for. How do I have a conversation and keep my job that this is not okay? We have issues internally that affect the way we work with our members. I guess that's the question.
And that's a tough question. So the first thing I would say is to be very honest and transparent with your boss. And if that doesn't work, then go to HR. But it's important to find out why. What's the reason why you can't have that project or you can't lead that effort? So find out what's the reason why. And then, quite frankly, you're going to have to call them on it. Am I not qualified to do this? And if I'm not qualified, can we do whatever I need to do to get qualified? So first of all, make sure that you are qualified to do it. And if you are, I'm not going to say demand that you have that experience, but I'm going to say that you should strongly have a strong conversation about why you want to do that and why you think that you're the best person for that job. Oftentimes, people don't just automatically give you something or let you do something if they're not in that space. Not because it doesn't mean that they're prejudiced. It might mean that they don't know that you have that. I have worked at places where people didn't know my skill level until I spoke up and said what it is I could do or was willing to do or wanted to do. And so what HR is supposed to be very sensitive. So I say take it to HR if you can't get resolution with your manager. And then if you need to, you can certainly call us at AACUC, and I would love to have further conversation with you. Sometimes it's case by case basis. So I don't want to just tell you blanketly do that because, as you said, we want you to keep your job. So you feel free to give me a call.
Another question kind of deals with credit union practices. Wanting to know if you have any recommendations for how credit unions can provide financial services that better serve African Americans. Is there any adaptation of current business practices, lending methods, credit analysis, and things like that?
So those are some very detailed questions that I certainly can't answer today on this call. What I will say is Filene Institute is doing a great job of collecting information, and we're sifting through that. You've got CUNA Mutual Group that has their multicultural business section that does a lot of research, and they do some really great work at finding out what things are different and how you do things differently. I want to give you an example with CUNA Mutual Group. So CUNA Mutual Group sells insurance to credit union members. And at one point, they were wondering why the African Americans did a really good job of signing up for the insurance, but when it came time to pay, they weren't really paying a whole lot. And so consistently. So they were trying to figure out what's the disconnect, what's happening here. So they did the research and they found out that they were not demanding, but the way to pay your premium was through automatic debit, or through your checking account. Well, the African Americans that were getting the insurance that weren't being consistent, they didn't pay through automatic debit. they're very closely watching their checking accounts probably, and so they would make their premiums through another medium, a money order perhaps. So again, just how do you do business? And so that was an excellent question. So there are different ways that business can be conducted for the people, for the community, peoples of color. For instance, Maria Martinez does a great job at her credit union with the Latino community. She's right by the border, and so they have done some wonderful things to translate information and for the native languages, so that they can make sure that they're serving their membership well. So what I would do is I would get with the African American leaders in your community who are the business leaders and have the conversation. How can we best serve you? What can we do to better make sure that you and your small businesses are served well? And I think that's the way to do that, is to make sure that you have a conversation with the people in your community.
Our board chair of World Council of Credit Unions, Steve Stapp, has a question, which I think a lot of people probably are wondering and maybe thinking it should have happened a long time ago, but he wants to know how we can get better representation at the board level, both for national organizations such as CUNA and also at CUSOs.
I'm going to need you to repeat that question in a second, okay? Sure. So Steve, thank you. Steve, right? Yeah. So what I will say is this: we have we have to know who's in the boardrooms now. So around the country at credit unions, I'm happy to report that I'm aware of 2 African American women who are doing a phenomenal job as chairwomen of their organizations. Coastal Credit Union out of North Carolina, and also SRP Federal Credit Union out of South Carolina. Now, I thought it was a wonderful thing that I met these 2 ladies. Sandra DeVoe Bland has been a member of AACUC for quite some time, over 20 years, and she's now the chair, first African American woman to be chair, first African American to be chair at SRP Federal Credit Union. And Joan, I think she's been the chair of Coastal for at least a decade, probably over a decade. But what's really cool about these 2 ladies is I was going to have the privilege of introducing them. They already knew each other. These smart ladies went to school together, graduated Georgia State. At the same time, they went to school together. Isn't that something that's kind of great? So the way to have more representation for African Americans in CUSOs and other organizations is to have the conversations, put them in the pipeline to be part of those board of directors. And often what doesn't happen is people of color aren't tapped on the shoulder or get the nod to be on these boards. And I think that that's what needs to happen, is that, one, we need to know that there are African Americans leading credit unions. And I don't think that we know enough about board chairs that are in credit unions. And so to get to a CUSO level, once you have that diversity, if you will, in your credit unions, then that will automatically bring you to the CUSOs. CUSOs are part of the credit unions.
All right, thanks, Renee. There's another great question here saying that credit unions have a field of membership that may be interpreted as limiting or selective. So how do you implement multicultural diversity or community messaging that would strengthen credit unions in a tested time of race defined like Black Lives Matters?
That's a good question. Not knowing how that state does field of membership, I don't want to answer that because so many states have different requirements. What I would say is that you try to open up your field of membership, if it's appropriate, to communities of color that you can assist. So find out within your said group or your field of membership, is there an organization that you can partner with that you can help expand your field of membership through your state charter or your federal charter?
I just want to say there are a lot of great questions here. I know some people have asked if this is being recorded. It is. It'll be available on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/woku, and it should be up later this afternoon. So it'll be up there, and please feel free to share it with other people in the credit union system or in your credit union. great question here too. How can we move beyond individual cases of bias and expect those who are being discriminated against to advocate for themselves and instead work to change the whole system? In most organizations, white leadership sets the rules, the standards, the organizational culture, etc. In other words, how do we move beyond discussions of individual racism to address the systemic and structural racism that is built into American society?
So, that's a loaded question. I think that if you don't address individual disparities, then you can't address the large disparities. And I think that with AACUC, we're working closely. We're looking at working closely with the leagues to set up some awareness about DEI specifically. And I think through the DEI offerings through AACUC, what CUNA's doing, the DEI Collective, Humanity, I think that these, NALCUP and Inclusive, I think that these organizations will be the leads to changing the conversation from being a conversation into action. And I know that Larry Sewell, my board vice chair, and Adrian Johnson, our chairman of the board, they feel very strongly about we have to be in action. We have to stop talking about it. Let's do what we need to do. Let's move forward. And so I think that from the individual conversation of discrimination and or racism to the larger conversation, it's about getting the organizations together and the heads of these organizations to agree that things have to change. I do customer service training through my company, Sattiewhite Training Productions. And I will not do customer service training for any organization that won't have their entire staff be trained. That means from the top down. The president has to do it, everyone has to do it. And so with this initiative, everyone has to decide that they want to do that, and it has to come from the top. So yes, there may be people who are not Black making the decisions about what the credit union should be and the rules about the credit union, but it's so important to have the many different voices at the table, because again, diversity is a business case. It's about business. And the credit union movement, we have a heart for people. So we want to make sure that we keep those things in mind, looking at how it's better for business if we have more voices at the table, because we get a better view of how to eliminate a problem.
Renee, this is a bit of a tough question for you, but I think it's an important one to somebody submitted, because it seems like there are a lot of white people in America who are asking this question, right or wrong. They're saying, I lose respect and don't want to listen to those that want to make change using looting and property destruction to be heard. Am I wrong? How do we get people of all colors to protest peacefully so we can all respect each other?
I would never say that someone is wrong. What I would say is be empathetic. Understand why it's happening. This is a symptom. So what's the cure? And the question that I would say is, if you don't have any respect for people who are looting and things of that nature, and you think that they're tearing down their community, my question to you would be, would you want to live in that community? In the food deserts, and the places that don't have the best looking parks, the places that the schools don't have the best and the new things for children to learn. When you're looking at whether or not you respect someone about looting or tearing down, quite frankly, when the peaceful protests were happening, such as Colin Kaepernick, when the NFL just was totally against that. He wasn't looting, he just kneeled. And so unfortunately, if you think about what has happened, it's not until the looting starts and the fires start that people feel like they're being heard, because then it's a problem. So we have to as a nation agree that we're going to listen before it gets to that point. So again, I wouldn't say anyone is wrong. What I would say is you have to think about, if you continue to ignore the problem, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger, that's the result. That's an end result of frustration. That's an end result of injustice. That's an end result. Anytime we can watch someone be murdered on television over and over and over again and appear to be very callous about it, we cannot be upset when people react in a certain way. And so I think that the way to do that is, again, put yourself in that person's place. How would you feel if it were your sister or your brother or your auntie or your uncle? How would you feel if that were how would you feel if something bad happened with a police officer to one of your loved ones? And so I think once you personalize it for yourself, walk a mile in my shoes, I think that would make the difference.
We've got a little over 10 more minutes, about 10 minutes left. And I'm just curious, Brian, if you've heard a lot of this conversation, and I know you're probably listening pretty intently. I'm just curious if you have any, if you want to pop your webcam on and if you have anything that's come out that you have further questions about for Renee.
Well, thanks. So Renee, one of the other, what I call uncomfortable questions that one has is, frankly, I've heard often from my colleagues, friends, persons of color, ask me, well, why is it that I am associated with criminal actions and a criminal class? Why does someone make these assumptions about me when they first see me, that I'm dangerous, that I'm risky?
Media images. So the media has contributed to the fear factor. And being a broadcast journalism major in communications, it's important what you're looking at. And so when you have images that are continuously shown at you that are disparaging of other people, that you think that all Black people eat fried chicken and ribs and are lazy. But those are stereotypes that just don't work, and they're just not true. Now, I do like fried chicken, I like watermelon, but it doesn't mean just because I'm Black that everybody does, and I know like Black people who don't. So I believe that that's the answer, is to understand that we are, because again, that racism, that control. If we don't show people of color in a great light, then people will continue to think that these negative stereotypes, the criminal element, if you will. Unfortunately, disproportionately, just as the health challenges are, but African Americans, especially men, are incarcerated at a far greater rate than white counterparts. And so that again, and for the same, again, the inequity in it, the same crimes could hold a different sentence for a person of color. So what is happening is the systems that are in place obviously are mostly designed by people who are not of color, but the majority at this point. And when you're looking at that, that's the marketing that's been set up. That's the images that have been set up. When President Obama was in office, I was thrilled because I saw a Black man and a Black woman and a family that were working together and very proud and represented this country well. And it made and so when you look at what the stereotypes for Black people traditionally are, they're not good ones. And so we just have to have more images that are true for all of us, for more professionals.
Renee, I think that's a good point, and one that's overarching and touches us all the time. Another point I'd make is that if I count the frequency of times that I've had conflict with a person of color compared with a person of my same skin color, the latter far outnumber the former. You mentioned something that I think is important to bring up as well, which is as you stand up and adjust your poster, we
Right.
have the great luxury privilege of being able to work at home. And yet I look at so many of our friends and our colleagues who are persons of color who don't have that advantage at this time of great health risk. And so, frankly, we hear from communities that the statistics of those who are suffering some of the greatest mortality and illness as a result of the COVID-19 crisis are people of color who can't afford to protect themselves, to work at home, and are at the front line in terms of providing some of the essential services that we are relying on at this time of crisis: health services, sanitation services, food services. Can you help us a little bit with understanding the impact of that and how that also affects our perceptions?
So, so imagine not being able to feed your family, not knowing where your money's going to come from, and we have the luxury, and for me, I call it a blessing, of working with AACUC and being in a position where I can work from home. The people who cannot, and not just the people of color, but all people who are in this, who are in a situation where they don't know where their next meal is coming from, they don't know how they're going to get their money, their job has been decreased or eliminated. That sense of frustration gets compounded, especially if people of color who are in cities that are and they're right next to each other, on top of each other in different apartments and types of homes, and so there's a level of frustration there, and I don't know if there's economic relief that's enough for it. So Brian, I really don't have the answer to that question. All I can tell you is that every morning when I get up, I have my cry. I watch the news and have my cry because I'm feeling for those people who have been affected by these different, by the health crisis and by the unemployment and certainly by the violence, just all that in their heads and watching these images. One of the things that I want us to remember about all of this is that it's important to love our fellow man, and we cannot allow these deaths to go in vain. Number one, for the racism, and then for the COVID, we want to make sure that we're reaching out to families that are losing loved ones, and that we stick close to people in this time. That we let them know that we care, that we're concerned. And so what I would say to that hard question, Brian, is that it's important that if you can and you have the luxury, help where you can. If that's in your synagogues, your churches, your fraternal orders, whatever that is, your sororities, help where you can.
I take it that's my cue. I did want to just again mention that if you want to share this has been just such a great discussion, really, Renee. I mean, I don't think we can thank you enough for taking the time and doing this for our membership and membership of our YCUP organization, our GWLN members and members of our sister societies. Again, this will be at youtube.com/WOCU. That's youtube.com/WOCCU. It should be up by later this afternoon. And there's one question, and Brian, you may want to respond to this as well, since we still have a few minutes here. I am definitely not smart enough to answer this, nor do I understand exactly what it means, but as both of you are in leadership positions, you probably can. Somebody asked how credit unions can avoid the trap of performative allyship when, I guess, when selecting leaders and executives and giving promotions and things like that.
Let me first take a stab at that. So, no one wants to get a job just because you're checking a box. It's important that whoever you're selecting to run your organizations or to do the jobs that you want them to do, that they've been vetted and that they can do the jobs. Oftentimes, some of our credit union partners, when they want to help us do something, they think that they need to do the work. They don't need to do the work. We have lots of talent and lots of volunteers that can help do the work. So I think that when you're looking at how do you select, you need to make sure that the person can get the job done, but be open to other people who don't look like you. Brian, I'm going to toss that to you now.
Thanks, Renee. You know, I fall back on the experience that we had with the Global Women Leadership Network. And, you know, what we saw a problem in the international creating system in that we didn't see very many women taking positions in the senior leadership, the CEO positions, the board positions. And when we grilled into those institutions more deeply, we found it wasn't a problem of cultural values, that we found these institutions were really working with cooperative values of equity and equality, but there were things about serving at that level that interfered with the ability of many women to take those positions. And so, like Renee pointed out earlier, when she was talking about the adequacy of the service or the service process, it's also about the employment process. It's about the responsibilities of those positions. And we found that there was a lot that credit unions could do themselves to address those institutional obstacles. And that had a very empowering impact on both women and men. The other thing we found was that very often women were looking for opportunities for professional development to move up, and there were constraints on their ability to do that. And in this world today, with tremendous communication capacity, virtual communications, the ability to provide that kind of empowerment, there were just lots of opportunities for the ability to empower women, just as there are for people of all ethnic groups. And the third point that Renee just mentioned is earlier was that there are lots of people that already have that capacity, and yet they may be reluctant to step up for fear of the reaction from others, or they may feel that this is not an environment that genders that kind of a confidence in themselves. And this is one of the things that the Global Women Leadership Network set out to do, is to create a peer network, which started with just women and then became women and men, to give that sense of peer support, sometimes coaching, sometimes mentorship, to encourage people to actually step up, show that they are qualified to lead that team or to take on that project, take that position. And as a result, frankly, we find a much richer leadership in the credit union system. And I think the same principle applies to our African American community as well.
Well, very good.
I think, and I love. I just want to add this: the Global Women's Network, chaired by Susan Mitchell, right? It's a wonderful thing, and I love he for she. And so, if we translated he for she for our allies for AACUC, I think that would help us, right?
Absolutely.
So that's
actually, you say something in your description of AACUC that it's not just for African American colleagues, but your colleagues of a lighter hue as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have all kinds of people who are at AACUC, and when you come to an AACUC event, you see people of different colors, different ethnicities, backgrounds, the staff level person to the senior executive, CEO, and chairman of the board. At AACUC, we are not an exclusive organization, we're an inclusive organization, and we were built that way from the very start. The only reason why we're the African American Credit Union Coalition is because we do have a unique perspective, and there was nothing like that available to us. And so, unfortunately, it's still necessary. I don't have a dream like Martin Luther King, but I do have a vision, and I have a vision of the All-American Credit Union Coalition soon.
Well, that's great. On that note, I got to tell you, we had about 230 attendees at the start of this webinar, and we only have lost about 20 or 30 over the course of the hour. So Renee, I think that really speaks volumes into how much light you've shed on this issue for us and how much interest there is among the credit union people and our members across the world. So thank you so much. And again, this will be on our YouTube channel later. Brian, if you have any closing thoughts.
Again, you've done us a great service sharing with us today, Renee, so we're very grateful to you. And very proud to be part of the global credit union community, which you helped lead.
Thank you. Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Greg. Appreciate you.
Thanks everyone.